and welcome with Tea Time with Lynette. And today I have my very dear friend, George Gammon, who is an entrepreneur. He is a real estate investor. He is absolutely brilliant, one of my most favorite people, and actually the first person that ever gave me the opportunity to speak at a live audience. So I love him. We've been together for a long time. And without further ado, I'd love to introduce you to my very good friend. I'm sure you already know him anyway. But George, thank you so much for being here today. I wanted to just jump right in with deglobalization, because I know that's what they're making it look like, and there are a lot of issues around deglobalization with the supply chains. But what are you seeing in the financial markets and the real estate markets?
Well, as far as Trumponomics, that would be number one. Trumponomics 2.0, he just came out with his new plan. I don't know how much of it he's going to get passed. I think obviously the probability of him winning is as close to 100% as you can get.
Yeah.
But, if we're going to take him at his word, which is, I don't know if you can really do it, Donald Trump. but if we're going to take him at his word, now to be clear, I have no problem telling people who I'd vote for. I would definitely vote for, even before Saturday night, I would vote for Trump way over Biden. I mean, it's not even close. And then Saturday night, I must say that I gained a lot of respect for Trump that I didn't have from a standpoint of him being a fighter or a warrior. I mean, the guy is, my goodness gracious, he's literally fearless. But we'll set that aside. But so now we have to, and thank goodness, thank God that he was spared and whatnot, but for not only his sake, but for the sake of our country. But then now we look at his economic plan. Okay, so first and foremost, we've got some things in there that I would consider good. We've got other things that I would consider bad. So this really highlights what's so important about proper economic analysis. And when I talk about proper economic analysis, rule number one is there are no solutions. There are only trade-offs.
Yeah.
Thomas Sowell teaches us this. So you can't have something that's just all good. Even a tax cut, I would argue, it isn't all good. It's just you have to determine on net balance.
Right.
So when you're determining on net balance, you have to weigh the costs versus the benefits. And so you have to do that individually with every single proposal that Donald Trump has. And then you have to group them all together and do the exact same thing. So if we go through, the first thing that I really liked a lot is proposing bringing the corporate tax rate down to 15%. Because what we have to start with is the understanding that true wealth of a society has nothing to do with the amount of dollars, the amount of Bitcoin. I would go so far as to say not even the amount of gold or silver. Because at the end of the day, nobody wants gold or silver. What people want are goods and services.
Right.
We have to remember that. It's just gold gives us a way to store our excess productivity in a way that we can maximize our purchases or our spending power for goods and services in the future. So what it all boils down to is how efficiently a society can produce stuff. This is the bottom line. So you look at lowering the tax rate, and that's going to, in my view, on net balance, incentivize more productivity. It's going to incentivize more investment, and it's going to incentivize corporations, businesses, small, medium, large, creating more of the stuff that society needs to become wealthier. Said another way, to increase the standard of living for everyone, especially the people at the bottom, the poor, and the middle class. So, but then we move to the next proposal that he's really gung-ho about. And these are these tariffs. Now, what's interesting is I just did a video on this, and Trump was referencing McKinley, which I didn't know this, but McKinley, obviously president right around the turn of the century. I didn't know he was really well known for tariffs. And according to Trump, he was. And I actually researched it, and yet he implemented all of these tariffs in lieu of an income tax. And so Trump is like, well, let's just lower taxes on everything, and then let's jack up tariffs to 60 to 100% on China, And this in and of itself is going to solve all of our problems. I'm like, whoa, time out, time out, time out, time out. Let's just do a cost benefit analysis of tariffs alone. And I can tell you from personal experience, Lynette, I've lived in countries, in fact, I live in one now,
Right.
that have quite a bit of tariffs. Now, Colombia, where I am right now, in Medellin, Colombia, they don't have a lot. When I was in Ecuador spending time there when I retired, Ecuador had a lot more, at least with the stuff I was buying. But I can tell you that tariffs here in Colombia, the ones that are most pronounced, the ones that you kind of see when you're looking around in like the everyday economy, is going to be most applicable to electronics and to automobiles. And so the automobile manufacturers are not absorbing the cost of the tariffs. I can assure you, that would be the consumer. If we just went on Auto Trader or Columbia's version of autotrader.com right now, and you looked at a Toyota Camry, it's literally going to be twice the cost of the United States. And it's because of those tariffs.
Right.
So if Toyota was just eating that cost, then you wouldn't see that much of a price discrepancy. And it's the exact same thing with electronics, which brings, you know, the rebuttal to that is going to be, well, it's completely different in Colombia because they don't have Ford. They don't have GM. They don't have all of these domestic producers. And that's, I'll grant you that point, but what you have to look at is, in reality, when we have seen tariffs, how do corporations, domestic corporations, how do they typically respond to this? And the way they respond to it, in my experience, in countries I've lived in the past, is it's just like UBI. It's like saying that we should give everyone UBI because this is going to benefit the consumer so much because it's going to give them more purchasing power, when in reality what it does is it just makes them fat and lazy.
Right. UBI is universal basic income is what you're referring to, right?
That's correct. That's correct. So basically what these tariffs would do, even if you want to argue that they're going to benefit corporations, domestic corporations within the United States, and bring all this manufacturing back, and you know that's typically the intent of these types of laws.
Right.
In practice, what ends up happening is it's actually detrimental for the consumer because the domestic corporations, it's just like welfare. It's like corporate welfare, basically, where they don't produce more. They, in fact, often produce less, but their margins are so massive,
right,
because they can undercut all, let's say, the Chinese products that have this 100% tariff on it, and then they start producing lower quality as well. Yeah. So you get less stuff and lower quality of stuff, even though domestically you're manufacturing it. So at the end of the day, that on net balance, that really doesn't work too well.
Well, it kind of sounds, I don't mean to interrupt you, but it sounds very inflationary. That's what it sounds like to me. Prices going up, productivity going down. So isn't that inflationary? And then what's the flip side of that coin?
So this is a great question, because to me, you know, I would never put myself in any camp. If I'm going to agree with a certain school of thinking, it's definitely going to be the Austrians. But there are things about Austrian economics I completely disagree with as well. But when it comes to kind of the inflation, excuse me, I would definitely land on the side of a monetarist, a Milton Friedman type, if you would. And what I mean by that is, to your, you know, when you look at this just at surface level, that would be most people's initial conclusion, is that if you jack up the prices on everything, basically at Walmart, Target, Home Depot, let's not forget that 90% of the stuff that most of your viewers buy daily, you know, Walmart, Target, that's going to be from China or India or Vietnam or something that now is going to have 100% tariff on it. And you are going to have to absorb that cost. And even if you want to argue that, oh, it's going to incentivize manufacturing, so now 50% of the stuff that you buy at Walmart is going to be made in America, fine, you're still going to be paying a much, much higher cost. And that doesn't take into consideration how long it would take you to get all these supply chains up and running. And all
Exactly.
these manufacturing plants, you don't just start creating every single thing that you see at Home Depot by flipping on a light switch. I mean, this
Exactly.
takes years and years and years, and sometimes, quite frankly, even decades to do this. But let's just assume for a moment that that stuff did increase in price. Okay. But what's going to happen since the banks aren't playing ball? And this is where I become a monetarist. Right now, the banks, as you know, bank credit is pretty much flat.
Right.
And if you look at M1 and M2 money supply going back a couple years, it's actually down. And we haven't seen a decrease in M2 money supply since the Great Depression.
Right.
So if you've got money supply declining, I'm not saying it's impossible, but it's very, very difficult to have sustained levels of consumer price inflation. And so if you look at the 1970s as an example, Lynette, and if you look at M2 money supply, it just went straight up. It's not like this, but I'm talking about it
Right.
just stayed and it tracked this trend. Even when Volcker jacked rates, and everyone thinks that because he took rates up to 18% or whatever, and that just crushed the money supply growth, and therefore that's why we went into a recession, and that's why he quote unquote broke the back of inflation. Absolutely not.
Not.
Look at a chart of M2. It didn't even budge. Even when Volcker was doing that, it didn't even budge. So he might have defeated inflation, but it sure as heck wasn't a result of decreasing the money supply. That's for sure.
Right.
But my point there is it during the 70s, it's going like this. And right now, at least since 2022, it's been going the opposite direction. And more recently, it's just kind of flattened out. So what happens there from just a simple amount of money that's available is if you see the stuff of, or if you see the price of the stuff that you need, that you have to have, shelter, food, energy, if you see that going up, well, then you're going to have to rob Peter to pay Paul,
Right.
because there's just simply not enough money that's going into the economy. And then you say, well, George, the prices could just adjust. That's typical Austrian stuff under a gold standard. Right. But this is just looking at it through the view or through the lens of being on the gold standard. And we can't analyze an economy based on what we want it to be. We have to analyze the economy based on what it is. And unfortunately, right now, we have a debt-based monetary system. And that debt-based monetary system does not do well as far as aggregate demand when the amount of currency units that are going into that economy decline or even flatten out, even if they're below trend. So that usually, ironically, that inflation actually leads to deflation, because the prices of the stuff that you need are going up. The prices of the stuff you want are going down to the point where all of those businesses that produce the stuff you want, they have to start laying off people. They have to start firing people, and that increases the unemployment rate. That decreases aggregate demand for the stuff that you have to have, and therefore those prices start to decline. And people would say, well, that's great because then those prices are coming down, but be careful what you wish for, because
Exactly.
that's when you're going into a recession. That's when you could be going into an economic depression, and that's obviously not a good thing for the majority of the consumers out there. So I know that's a long-winded answer to your question, but my base case would be that you would see initial consumer price inflation, but that would actually trigger a recession where prices would come down because of the bad reasons we talked about if we already weren't in a recession. And my view is more of the 1940s as opposed to the 1970s, because I don't think the banks will create enough currency units, will extend enough loans like they did in the 1970s to have that sustained inflation where the consumer wouldn't be put into a position where they have to rob Peter to pay Paul. Because I just see the risk in the banking system right now getting higher and higher and higher. And I'm not talking about just the regional banks in the United States with commercial real estate. I'm talking about all these global banks in the Eurodollar system outside of the United States, such as Norinchukin in Japan. I mean, that's a big, big deal what's happening over there. And that's a systemically important bank, as most of them are now. And you can't have the banking system falter in the global monetary system, the Eurodollar system, without that impacting the U.S. banks and therefore the U.S. economy. And the economy is going to go wherever the banks go. unfortunately, again, that's the system that we're in, because if they stop extending credit, that's when the house of cards comes crashing down. So that's what I would say, or that's what I would suggest most people think about in terms of the inflationary pressures that would be caused by the Trump tariffs if he's able to implement them.
Well,
Now, another thing that he's talking about is reducing the size of government. Now, this I love. This I
right.
love, but I have a very hard time believing that Trump is going to do that. Number one, because he's talking about tariffs, which by definition is increasing the size of the government in the free market, but also because of what he did the last time. I mean, Trump was not a small government guy, even though he might have said that. He expanded the size of government. Let's not forget the deficits absolutely blew out
Right.
under Donald Trump. If you look at the deficit as a percentage of GDP, I mean, it was going the wrong way, even before, we'll call it the cerveza sickness. And then it just got even worse. And now I'm not saying that Trump would be worse than Biden. Biden would probably make deficits even worse. But again, that doesn't mean that Trump is a small government guy. And
Right.
so when he references McKinley as an example of kind of like the playbook on how to make this work, what he's doing there is he's looking at a time in U.S. history. We don't even know if it worked. On net balance, it might have been a negative. And the research that I did, it seemed like it was probably a negative or a drag on the economy. But let's just assume for a moment that it was a net positive. What you're doing is you're comparing a time when government spending as a percentage of GDP, Lynette, was like 5%. So
We're not there anymore.
no, we're at 50% now, roughly, when you include state and local. So if you're trying to turbocharge the economy and bring back manufacturing, that's way, way, way easier to do when government is such a microscopic percentage of the overall economic output. When government is 50%, it's almost like you could take the tax rate down to zero, and you could do all these other things, and it's just going to completely overwhelm the producers in the economy because they have so many of these bureaucratic hurdles and red tape to go through just to produce a widget. I would use Argentina as a fantastic example. You know that I was there just a few months back.
I do.
And they might have higher tax rates than the United States, but I can assure you no one's paying them. And everyone is doing everything under the table. So effectively, they pay a very low tax there. But they still have a lot of economic issues. Why? Because the government is so overbearing, or at least it was prior to Milei, that you still can't produce any stuff, even though all the other variables are in place. So the way I said it in the video is that if I had to choose between today's size of government and no tariffs, if I had to choose between that and tariffs, but the size of government that we had in the 1890s, okay, I'll take the tariffs.
Right.
I'll take the tariffs. I think it's suboptimal, but I think that would be a much, much, much better system. But I highly doubt that Donald Trump is going to take the size of government back to what it was during McKinley's time. I think my base case, if you will, is that Trump, even if he reduces the size of government, he's just going to reduce the size of growth. It's like the difference between deflation and disinflation. He's not talking about deflation as far as prices going down. He's talking about disinflation, where prices are just going up at a slower rate.
Well,
so
go ahead. You're talking about deflation, inflation, all of that, and we got to talk about the Fed pivot, because the interest rates are the tool. What tools do they have? And if we do, I am in agreement with you. I think that we are going to see more inflation before we see the deflation. But gosh, there's only one way to fight deflation, and that's with more inflation, and vice versa. So
yeah.
And the markets are loving the thought that interest rates can go down. What's your opinion on all of that garbage?
It's all narrative.
It is.
It's all narrative.
Yeah.
And we see this in and you know this better than I do. We see this every single cycle with the Fed, probably since Greenspan, where just before the market starts to turn, you start off with good news being good news.
Right.
That's how the market starts going up and starts recovering, if you want to call it that. We'll go back to, I don't know, 2010 as an example, 2011. So any little good news there starts to become good news and stops the market crash, and it flattens out. You have that consolidation period, and
Gee,
then
I
you
thought it
start
was
going back.
QE.
Oh, it's QE, it's government spending, it was a lot
Right.
of these things. But I think the biggest part there was probably the mark-to-market accounting,
Oh,
where
yeah.
they knew that the banks were kind of out of the danger zone, if you will. But this happens every single cycle. And then good news becomes good news. And then you just get this bull market that wants to continue to go higher and higher and higher and higher. So even though the good news starts turning into bad news, well, the market still goes up, and sometimes goes up even more aggressively, because bad news is good news, meaning that, oh, well, my gosh, if the unemployment
Right.
rate is going up, well, this is fantastic because this increases the probability that the Fed's going to drop rates. And everybody knows that the Fed dropping rates is fantastic for stocks. So you get the Jim Cramers out there saying buy, 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 buy. Well, that works until it doesn't,
Right.
because at a certain point in time, and we see this every cycle, the bad news becomes so overwhelming that the market flips. And now all of a sudden, bad news becomes bad news. And when that happens, that narrative changes, that's when you usually see the market go down by, call it 20, 30, 40%, something like that. You know what? I've been using this example on my channel quite a bit. I think it's just like the Biden-Trump debate the other day. So leading up to that debate, the mainstream media was trying to sit there and tell you that Joe Biden was 100%, that Joe Biden was a Rhodes Scholar. Joe Biden is as sharp as a tack, but he just has some sort of stutter. Or they'd say, they'd make up some ridiculous excuse, where every single person out there that was watching Joe Biden, regardless of whether you're on the left or the right, you're like, what? No, this guy, I feel sorry for him, but he's obviously losing his mental faculties here. He's obviously not mentally 100%. But the mainstream media kept telling you this nonsense over and over and over again, basically trying to tell you that, don't believe your lying eyes.
Right. Well,
But
that's
then
what
what
they always
happened
do.
is you had that debate, and
Yeah.
then that's an example of the bad news being good news. But then you had the debate where even the mainstream media on the left, they're like, okay, the gig is up here. There's no way. Now it's so obvious that there's no
Yeah.
way we can continue to push this narrative without completely looking like fools. So we're going to have to switch and be like, okay, they're not going to say they got it wrong, but they sit there and say, well, now, okay, yes, it's true. Joe Biden needs to step down. It just happened all at once. It was just that one night where everyone had to admit the reality. It's like the emperor's wearing no clothes moment.
Right.
And that's what happens every single time in the cycle. The problem is trying to time that. It's trying to time it. Because let's just use the inversion of the yield curve. When the curve is usually inverted, that's a warning sign for the recession.
Huge.
But that's usually when stocks are going higher and higher and higher, because you're in that bad news is good news. But then what happens is the curve uninverts, which, by the way, we just saw with the 2s and the 30s, if you want to talk about that. And usually when the curve starts to uninvert and stays uninverted or steepens out to a sustained degree or through a sustained period of time, that's usually when the stuff hits the fan, if you will, and you see the majority of the stock market decline that the yield curve had been predicting, let's say, for the last 2 years. And what's interesting is usually that curve steepens out and stays that way as a result of the Fed dropping rates. Not because they're dropping rates because they've just achieved nirvana or this perfect soft
Right.
landing or that
Exactly.
they're geniuses. No, they're dropping rates because they're responding to a crisis. They're always behind the curve, so I don't see why it's going to be any different this time, where they keep rates too high, too long, or however you want to blame them. But the bottom line is they get blindsided by
Yeah.
something. They get caught off sides, and then all of a sudden they've got to take rates not down by 25 basis points, but they got to take rates down by 100, by 200 basis points, and they got to do that, several times in a row to respond to whatever is making the stuff hit the fan. And once you see the Fed drop for the very first time, and then that curve steepen out, that's usually around the time when you start to see a recession or a hard landing. And the good news is that's usually not too late. So if you're trying to set up your portfolio accordingly, you may say, well, I've got to do that now. I've got to try to time the top, if you will, because as soon as they start dropping rates, well, then it's going to be too late because the stock market's already down by 30%. No, 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 no. Usually what happens is the Fed drops rates and the bulk of the move, not only in the stock market, the bond market, the gold market comes after that. So there's no way to time this stuff. But as far as me and my own portfolio, that's how I'm trying to time it to the best of my ability.
Well, you take a look and it's very destabilizing when they turn around and they're forced to lower the rates. But what is that going to do to the inflation? Because when they lower the rates, in theory anyway, and probably in practicality, we're getting more of that, right?
Yeah, it depends on what the banks do. It depends on what the banks do, because I'm someone that I don't believe the Fed is at the center of the monetary solar system.
Yeah, I agree with that.
I think it's the banks. It's the banks. And you can sit there and talk about the Fed's balance sheet and all these things. But if you really understand bank settlement, like I know you do, you realize that bank reserves, or the amount of bank reserves that the Fed has on their balance sheet, it really doesn't impact the balance sheet capacity for the banks themselves. And if you go back and look at, let's just say, 2020, when M2 money supply went up by 25%, you can say, well, my gosh, George, look at the Fed's balance sheet expanded and you saw M2 go up. Right. But that's mainly because they're buying from non-bank entities who are selling. And that's really savings. So it's low velocity money. So I don't want to get too technical on everybody. But the bottom line is most of that 25% increase that we saw wasn't necessarily a result of the Fed doing QE, but is more so a result of people drawing down their credit lines, because they were worried about the world coming to an end, because that was right in the middle of the whole pandemic and the lockdown. So all these businesses, before they get their PPP, they're drawing down that credit line, which is what that increases bank credit, which at the end of the day, that money that the banks are lending, that is being loaned into existence.
Exactly.
What people have to understand is when banks lend money, they're not lending money that already exists.
Right.
That's not what happens.
So
When they make a loan, that's brand new money, just like your little money printer thing there. There you go. That's exactly what happens when banks lend money, is they're creating brand new money that didn't exist before. And the only way that money can be, quote unquote, destroyed is if that loan gets paid off.
Right.
Then the money supply goes right back to where it was, all else being equal. But what the Fed is doing on their balance sheet, it's really not doing that much, because the banks don't need those bank reserves in order to settle transactions. What's far more important is the amount of perceived risk within the monetary system. And another good way to explain this, Lynette, it's like if you gave any of your viewers, let's say, $1 million to go out there and loan. Let's just assume for a moment that banks lent money that they actually had and they didn't create money.
Right.
And you said, okay, go out there and lend. All right, well, if you can't find any loans where the risk reward makes sense, no matter how much money you have, you're not going to lend it out.
That's right.
Like you're not going to lend it out. If every single person that has their hand out for a loan, you know darn well they're not going to pay you back. You could have $1 trillion on your balance sheet and you're not going to lend it out. So what the banks are doing, they look at Silicon Valley Bank, they look at First Republic, they look at this banking crisis that I believe we're only in the middle innings of, especially when you look at the overseas banks and what's happening there and how that will spill over likely into the United States. And they're looking around the economy and they're saying, whoa, no. We see way too much risk. There's no one out there that we want to lend to. And then on the demand side, there's a lot fewer people that want loans because they know they can't afford the payments. And so what do? They just say, oh, instead of lending out to the real economy, we'd much prefer just to buy treasuries. We'd much prefer just to buy the long end of the curve. And you can say, oh, that's terrible, that's a bad mistake or whatever. But the bottom line is you're not running a bank. And these global financial institutions, that's what they always do. And to them, inflation doesn't even matter that much, because they're just looking at the delta between the liability side of their balance sheet and the asset side of their balance sheet. And in the Eurodollar system, even if it's a Singaporean bank, if the majority of their deposit liabilities or the liability side of their balance sheet is denominated in dollars, they're not going to go out there and buy gold, as an example, to offset that, because there's too much FX risk. There's too much FX risk. Just
Right.
in, I know
Foreign
gold's not that
exchange.
volatile, but they could not afford to have gold go down, let's just say by 10%. And that, because that would put them in the exact same position that a Silicon Valley bank would be if they get some deposit flight. So to minimize risk to the greatest uh, degree, they have to, if their liability side of the balance sheet is denominated in dollars, they've got to try to somehow match up the asset side and have that denominated in dollars as well. So that's dollar assets. And if they're looking around the global economy and they're seeing a lot of risk, the bottom line is that dollar asset is most likely going to be the long end of the curve, which is usually why you see it invert before something bad happens, because that's the bond market, that's the financial system telling you that there's storm clouds on the horizon.
So by the 30 or the 2 and the 30 re-inverting, right?
Yeah.
Is that your indication that there's storm clouds on the horizon?
Well, the storm clouds are indicated by the yield curve.
Right.
But what the uninversion tells you is that the timing is we're getting closer to, again, I'll say the stuff hitting the fan here just to keep it YouTube and family friendly. So, because when the curve is inverted, you never, well, not never, but going back to the 1950s, you never have a recession.
Right.
You never have a recession when the curve is inverted. It's always right after the curve uninverts. That's my point. So this is what you really have to watch out for. And so, but the whole curve has to be uninverted. Right now, there's still a lot of inversions. And in fact, the 2s and the 30s went back to being inverted, but it rarely happens just all in one foul swoop.
Right.
Usually the yield curve, and it inverts the same way, where it's like that person that goes to the pool and they don't want to dive in. They just kind of put their toe in the water to test how cold the water it is, and then it's really cold and like, oh no, I don't want to do that.
Right.
And then they get a little bit more aggressive and they put their foot in, and then finally they go ahead and dive in. Well, the yield curve inverts and uninverts the exact same way. So what we saw the other day with the 2s and the 30s is basically that person just sticking their big toe in the water. And so now what we have to watch for is, when it well, it gets a little confusing here, but when it uninverts,
yeah.
and then we got to watch for the 2s and 10s. And then the real indicator there is the 3-month and the 10-year. But usually that doesn't uninvert until the Fed's dropping rates. And then that's another one of your timing signals.
Well, it's really interesting that we're talking about this because the yield curve has now been inverted the longest time in history. What do you think that is telling us? I mean, they want us to think it doesn't matter, right? Oh, well, it used to foretell, but this time is different.
That's nonsense. That's the whole yield curve is dead argument is just, it's just nonsense, because I think that's a fundamental misunderstanding as to why the curve inverts to begin with. And I think the curve inverts because these people that are buying the long end of the curve, these massive financial institutions, hedge funds, or et cetera, have insider information. Now, I'm not talking about illegal insider information, but they are sitting there talking to global corporations daily.
Right.
They're sitting there talking to the people that are trying to borrow the money, the entrepreneurs. They have information that we just don't have access to. And they have a read on the global economy far better than the Federal Reserve, as an example. So if they're the ones that see the storm clouds first.
Right. I'd agree with that.
Because they're in the trenches. And then they, not only that, but you can see rate differentials. You can see, credit spreads. You can see all these things, and the credit spreads are tight right now, which I think could be a black swan. But their bottom line here is
I'm sorry, I don't mean to interrupt you, but could you explain why the credit spreads should matter to our viewers?
Yeah. So
and
what
happens?
The credit spread is just simply the delta between like the 10-year Treasury and corporate junk debt.
Right.
So, and by the way, junk just means anything that's not investment grade.
Right.
So usually if you're going into a recession or you're in a recession, those corporate spreads are going to go way higher than the 10-year treasury, because the 10-year treasury is the safety and liquidity play. That's what everyone piles
In
into
theory.
when they're worried about, let's say, an economic crash.
Mm-hmm.
But if you're worried about an economic crash, what you don't want to do is lend money to a corporation. And therefore, there's fewer people lending them money, and therefore the yields go up, the price goes down. The yields go up, which increases the delta between that 10-year, call it risk-free rate, and then the rate at which these junk borrowers in the U.S. corporate debt market can borrow. So that's one of the telltale signs, again, going back to that timing. But what's interesting, what your viewers need to watch out for this time around, Lynette, is the fact that all of these global banks, not all, but a lot of these global banks like Norinchukin are in a position where they have to buy that corporate junk debt. They don't have a choice. No matter how risky it is, no matter how risky they think the economy is, they still have to buy it. And here's why. Because they got caught way off sides where their dollar funding costs. So if we just think about a balance sheet, and you've got assets on one side, liabilities on the right. Well, everyone knows that the way a bank makes money is they lend short term and they borrow long term at a higher interest rate. They pocket the spread. So back in 2021, when interest rates were very low, they said, oh my gosh, my dollar funding costs, in other words, the liability side of my balance sheet, all the dollars that I'm getting in, these global banks, I only have to pay my depositors or the people I'm borrowing from, I only have to pay them like 1%. So why would I not just borrow, just monthly? They got to roll. It's short term, so they have to roll over this debt. Let's just say every single month for the sake of the example. Why would I not just borrow at 1% and buy treasuries at 3%?
Right.
I mean, this just makes
Easy
sense.
money. Mm-hmm.
But what happens is they were not anticipating the Fed taking rates up to 5.25%, which now all of a sudden means that instead of paying the 1% for the dollar funding or the liability side of the balance sheet, they're having to pay 5. Well, if you're paying 5 to make 3, that dog don't hunt.
No.
that
really good.
That means that you're hemorrhaging money every single month, not just on the balance sheet, but on the P&L.
Right.
On the P&L.
Right.
So we call it a negative carry. So you have to pay every single month. You have to pay out in order to hold that position. So what does this force them to do? Well, we saw Norinchukin Bank the other day take a $10 billion hit because they had to sell all of those treasuries because they didn't have treasuries yielding 5%. They had treasuries yielding 3%. But the thing is, they not only have to take the hit, but they now have to buy something, some dollar asset that's going to yield them more than they're paying to borrow the dollars to begin with. So let's just say that you're borrowing dollars at Fed funds, 5.25%. Okay, well, you've got to find an asset that's going to pay you 7 or 8. Well, good luck. What asset is going to pay you 7 or 8%? Well, really, the only game in town, and Norinchukin said this, are derivatives, like CLOs.
Yep.
And so what they did is they sell all of their treasuries at 3% and buy CLOs at, let's just say, 7%. But the underlying asset to that derivative is something like commercial real estate or something like corporate debt, corporate junk debt. So what happens is, in an indirect way, all these global banks that put themselves into that position have no choice but to go out and buy the riskiest assets, such as CLOs, that where the underlying asset is this corporate debt. And by the way, the corporations that really can't borrow from banks because they're too risky, or something like commercial real estate, which we all know is blowing up in real time right in front of our eyes. So this is why I put the probabilities of disinflation or maybe even deflation pretty high. That would be my base case over the next year or so. If we go into a recession, I definitely think it'll be a disinflationary, deflationary recession because the banks aren't playing ball. And the banks are in big, big trouble, unlike the 1970s. But to your point, I think that de or disinflation will lead to the, let's just call it the economic interventions from the central planners that will take us into that next wave of consumer price inflation. Not like the 70s, but more so like the 1940s.
Yeah.
Where and remember, they had price controls back then. And by the way, who's talking about price controls right now? That would be Joe Biden. He's talking about, and I've predicted this. I know you have been predicting this for years, where you said they're going to come out with price controls. They're going to do it.
Right.
And sure enough, Biden is now talking about nationwide rent control. Nationwide rent control. But it's the exact same thing they did in the 40s, same thing they did in the 70s. And so when they took out those price controls in 1947, what did inflation do? It just went parabolic. It went up to 19%. 19%. Right. But then 2 years later, it was down at -2. So we go from 19% inflation, boom, crashing down to 2% deflation. And then what happens? We go into another wave of consumer price inflation where it got up to, didn't get up to 19, but it got up to maybe 10, 11. So I think you're going to see the exact same thing in the United States. I would predict, I hate to give predictions, but I'll say my base case, because again, there's no certainties, there's only probabilities. At the end of the day, we're all guessing at this stuff. But we're just trying to use our best guess.
Right.
I would say 2024, 2025 will be probably disinflationary, if not deflationary, for like a quarter. Like, remember in 2009, we had a quarter of deflation. It was, I believe, Q2 or Q3 of 2009, we had deflation. Mm-hmm. So I would expect something like that. But then going into the latter parts of 2025 or 2026, then I think the CPI goes back up to, in fact, I wouldn't be surprised if it went back up to 9, maybe even more.
Well, you said that you think the central bankers have lost control or are losing control.
I don't think they ever had it.
No, I don't either. I think it really is. I agree with you. It is really the corporations, particularly the banks, but that goes to liquidity, and that goes to global spillover. So, they're talking about deglobalization, but I don't know. I'm seeing further integration in the financial areas, aren't you? Or what are you seeing?
Absolutely. What you're talking about, what most people need to understand, that money as we know it, and I know the true definition of money, we'll call it currency, dollars, as we know them. It's not really money like paper currency or like a gold coin or something. All it is really is just a network of global bank balance sheets. That's all it is. It's very similar to the internet. And that, because what is a dollar at the end of the day, other than a printed piece of paper in your back pocket? A dollar, 99% of them are just simply an IOU from a bank that was created by lending it into existence. It's simply just a deposit. Technically, it's called a commercial bank deposit liability. That's all money, or what most people consider money. That's all it is. So what happens is, what people realize is, if all the banks went bust, we would have no money.
Exactly.
All the dollars would be gone. All the dollars would be gone. So the reason we got to this system to begin with, to your point, is because of globalization. So if you have deglobalization, you could probably do that, but it can't happen too quickly, or else you're going to interfere with that network. And if you interfere with that network, that's going to bring the whole system, whether we like it or not, crashing down. The example that I've been using on my videos, and I think people get a great visual from this, is it's a lot like these Tour de France races, these bike races, where back in the 1800s with the banking system, it was a lot like the bike racers. When you see them separated, they're kind of all in a straight line, and they're all separated by about 20 feet. You see that part of the race. So if one of these guys crashes, they get a flat tire and fall over the wall or whatever, it really only impacts them. All the other riders can kind of dodge them and go around. That was the 1800s. But then what we had after Bretton Woods is the creation of the Eurodollar system. So let's just fast forward to like 1950, 1960s. Then what happened is the banks became more and more interconnected. Why? Because they needed to create dollars, because there wasn't enough dollars coming out of the United States due to the trade deficit to fund global growth. So they were in a predicament. Well, we have all these demand for dollars. We don't have enough demand. We don't have enough dollars. So what do? Let's create them. We'll just create them, by creating a liability, a dollar liability, and then the offsetting asset, which is the loan. And like, as long as we all trust each other and we can settle just by using credit from one bank to the next bank, we don't need any of these stupid dollars. We can just create them ourselves. So this is how the euro dollar system started to evolve. The problem with that is that each bank's liabilities is another bank's assets.
Right.
So
Right.
it's not just one bank being globally systemic or systemically important. All of them are pretty much systemically important. So in the 1950s and 60s, you can imagine one of those Tour de France crashes where they're not all in a line like this, but now they're kind of more grouped together. So if one of the bikers goes down, let's say there's 200 participants or 200 riders, he takes out like 20 of them. So he takes out 10% of the peloton, I think they call it. That was the 1950s, 1960s. Now we fast forward to today. Today, not only are they not spread out, but they are so tight together. Every single person in this bike race, Lynette, is millimeters apart. So if you have one guy at the front that hits like a spectator, which is one of the examples I gave on my video, he hits a spectator in the entire race, the entire peloton, every single rider crashes as a result of that one guy at the front going down, because they're all so interconnected. They're all so close. That's the banking system today. That is the global monetary system we have. It's not the global monetary system we like, but it's the one we have. And so we're trying to predict inflation, deflation, or recession, or what have you, stock market up, gold up. We have to analyze this through the lens of reality.
Right.
And unfortunately, that's the reality we have right now, which in that environment, it is very difficult to get sustained levels of consumer price inflation unless you have these government economic distortions that we saw in 2020, which my base case is that we will see again. But when you don't have that much, because again, this is diminishing returns. So it's not like we can just come out and see more government deficit spending, and that's going to take us up to 9%. No, we have to, if the banks aren't playing ball because of what we stated earlier, you're going to have to see the level of deficits go to 15%, 20% of GDP. You're going to have to see whatever we saw in 2020 and 2021 that created the inflation. We're going to have to see double that.
Double.
Because
triple.
they're basically fighting the deflationary pressures of what's happening with the monetary system in the global economy, which by the way, that even if they're able to, let's just say they cancel one another out, unfortunately, that still impacts especially the poor and middle class negatively.
Right.
Because all of that government spending that's required to offset the deflationary pressures creates the economic distortions that reduces the productivity of society at large and brings down the standard of living. And we saw that play out perfectly throughout the last 4 years. You know, another example I use, Lynette, because I always try to tell people that the problem with the U.S. deficits is not the bond market. Because most people say, oh, the bond market's going to blow up, or we're going to have a debt crisis or something like that. That the problem is the economic distortions the spending in and of itself creates. Because if we go back to 2019, let's say, the deficit, or excuse me, the total debt was right around 22 trillion. Okay. Now we're over 34, over 34 trillion. And yet we have not seen a problem in the bond market. Now, the rates have gone up, yes, because Fed funds. But look, if anything, there's too much demand for treasuries because the curve is inverted. Let's look at that's what they're telling you. And if you go back in time prior to 2019, Lynette, if you go back to, let's say, 2007, in 2007, we had about 9 trillion in debt.
Right.
Now, like I said earlier, 34 trillion. But yet the bond yields at the long end of the curve, identical.
Good point.
Identical. So I'm not saying that we won't have a debt crisis in the future, but what I am saying is the debt crisis really isn't the bond market. the debt crisis is the government spending, because look, we had no or bond market crisis over the last 4 years, but did we have a crisis in the economy? Absolutely we did. Absolutely we did. Look at the homelessness rate.
Right.
Look at the
Yes.
drug use. Look at just, I mean, open up your eyes, for heaven's sakes. Would anyone argue that they are better off now than they were in 2019? Look at the access to goods and services you have. I don't care what your portfolio is doing.
Right.
Your access to goods and services has gone down. And then if you look at this through the lens exclusively of the poor and middle class, although their nominal wages might have gotten up, it hasn't gone up with the rate of inflation. Therefore, their purchasing power has gone down. This is what I'm talking about. That's the problem. That's why the deficit, if you will, is unsustainable. It's because of what it does to the economy, not necessarily what it does to the bond market.
That's a really good point. Although even in the bond market, to your point earlier, with how much are the banking system sitting on in underwater debt, right? I mean, that's everything that was created during that period of time that they're still holding on to when we were down at ZERP.
So this is a great point. I just did a video on this, in fact, where you've got the unrealized losses on the balance sheets for the banks. And I'm talking about the U.S. banks specifically, and I'm doing that right off the top of my head because that's the chart I use for my video, which is right here on the whiteboard. So the unrealized losses right now on banks' balance sheets, just in the U.S., are hovering right around 700 billion. 700 billion.
Plus all the derivatives.
Sorry?
Plus all the derivatives.
Yeah, that does not include
Right.
derivatives. This includes just the on-balance sheet stuff.
Exactly.
And this, I would assume, just includes the portion of the asset side of their balance sheet, which is hold to maturity.
Yeah.
So it's just the hold to maturity stuff. So they don't have to mark that to market. And so just the hold to maturity stuff, let's say they've got 700 billion of losses. Well, you say, George, that doesn't sound like a big deal, because we know the banking system in the United States alone is trillions and trillions and trillions of dollars. Okay, fine, but let's just compare that to the GFC. The maximum we saw in unrealized losses during the GFC was 75 billion. It's almost 10 times that now. So that in and of itself should tell you the risk that we have in the banking system. Now, it is true that they just held those assets to maturity, then they got no problem. They've got no problem. But the question is, can they do that? Obviously, if they get deposit flight, they can't, because Silicon Valley Bank was a great example.
Right.
And obviously, if their funding costs go up to the point where it doesn't make sense, they've got to sell those unrealized losses, become realized losses, like they did in the case of Norinchukin Bank, which decreases global dollar liquidity even more because it increases the amount of perceived risk in the monetary system, regardless of what the Federal Reserve is doing.
Yeah. I'm telling it. I mean, this thing is so deep, and we're talking about all the derivatives because back in the day, in 2007, there were certainly a level of derivatives in the market, but we are a lot higher than that now. And plus, with all of the formula shifts that they've made to really hide the nominal value, the true, I mean, nobody knows what true value is at risk anyway. It's so hidden and leveraged and convoluted. So, I mean, do you think that would overwhelm the central bank's ability even to print us out? I mean, does that take us into that hyperinflationary depression?
I think it's that would be a deflationary depression first.
Right.
And then it depends on, because I don't think, regardless of what the Fed does with their balance sheet, and let's just say they take it to 20 trillion, you're talking about just a drop in the bucket when you look at the dollar liquidity needs for the entire global economy, which at the end of the day, if the global economy crashes, the United States is not going to get around that.
No.
We're just too interconnected. So you've got the Fed, and then by the way, even if they do increase their balance sheet to 20 trillion, how do they get those? They have to have the banks play ball. I mean, or they have to have the sellers play ball, from the standpoint of the sellers of those treasuries that they're buying have to be non-bank entities for it to impact M2. And then you've got to assume that those people are going to go out and somehow spend the money. And it's just very low probability. So again, it goes back to the banks, and why on earth in that scenario would the banks be willing to take on risk by lending into the economy or just creating that dollar liquidity globally. They're going to be doing the opposite. And that's usually why you see the Fed just kind of, not to be crude or anything, but as my father used to say, just pissing into the wind. That's usually what happens with their balance sheet is it doesn't really impact anything. And a lot of people think that it impacts the stock market and whatnot. But if one of your viewers has that impression, I would highly encourage them to go look at the stock market increase from 1980 to 2000 when we had no QE. And by the way, the Fed's balance sheet in 1980, the bank reserves were 40 billion. In 2007, Lynette, they were 40 billion.
40 billion.
They did nothing. And yet the stock market during that time frame went up much more in percentage terms than it did from, let's just say, 2009 to today when they started QE. So again, that goes back to the example as to why the banks are really what drives everything. They drive everything. And to answer your question, no, I don't think the Fed can overwhelm the banks. I think that what could counter it would be government spending. That'd be government fiscal. So if government starts doing UBI, now if we have a CBDC, everything changes. Because then I take a completely different view, because the monetary system itself changes. The whole structure of the monetary system changes to the point where the Fed's bank reserves or the Fed's balance sheet now becomes broad money. And Dr. Lacey Hunt, I think, says it well. He says that when you take bank reserves and turn them into legal tender, that's the game changer right there. That's when the whole entire monetary system changes, because the central bank can circumnavigate the banks. And in that type of system, monetary system, base money and broad money are the exact same thing. They're indistinguishable. Where now they're two completely separate things. Base money doesn't really chase goods and services, whereas broad money, M2, that's the money that's in people's savings account and checking account. That is the metric that you got to watch to see how much demand is out there chasing the amount of goods and services available in the economy. So if we get that CBDC, then we're not only going to have a retail. Most people think about a retail CBDC, but what they have to think about also is a wholesale. CBDC, and that's interbank. That's interbank, and then the Fed, forget these stupid swap lines that still are dependent on the banks doing something. Then the Fed would have the ability to directly inject dollars, if you will, not just into the U.S. economy, but into the global economy. And that would be when I would change my stance or my base case from being like these waves of disinflation, deflation, inflation to pretty much a straight line of inflation.
Yeah, well, they say once they have control of those interest rates and of direct control, they can have their finger on the button 24/7. That's why you got to have wealth outside of the system. And George, we didn't even begin to scratch the surface on what I could talk to you about. But
no, gold's at all-time highs. How could we not talk about that? And by the way, the chart, you're a technician.
Yeah.
You know that the chart on gold right now looks fantastic.
Oh, yes,
it looks really, really good.
Well, when you have that breakout, even if it's manipulated for a while, yeah, and it's still severely undervalued at these levels, severely undervalued. But I think, we are at the beginning of a new bull market run, and there ain't no fever like gold fever. It's just the way it works.
Yeah. I that is definitely my base case, is that over the next 10 years, nominal price of gold is going one way.
Oh, yes. I would absolutely agree with that. And I'm a big believer in gold and silver. I trust.
That's right.
Well, thank you so much for being here. How about telling our viewers how to find you? Because he's my very brilliant friend. I love him to pieces. And I suggest that you go to his channel, George Gammon, on YouTube, and also Rebel Capitalist. And where else, George?
Oh, that's the best way. If people prefer podcasts or audio at the gym or whatever, you can just look up the Rebel Capitalist show on iTunes. And those are just the audio versions of my live streams on the Rebel Capitalist Show, which I do usually a couple times a day. So plenty of content over there.
Oh, lots of content and fabulous content. And I love your 3-step whiteboards. I think it really helps people understand what's happening, and you do it really, really well.
Thank you. Thank you.
Well, thank you for coming on. I hope to see you very soon, and maybe even in person at some point in here. That would be great. And I hope you guys got as much out of this as I did. Make sure you send any questions. Go in and see George, and you can ask him any questions, because as you see, I'm sure everybody that's watching knows you. I can't imagine that they don't. But we've been friends for a long time. Thank you so much for coming. And as always, I know that together we can make a positive difference for a lot of people. So let's keep coming together in community. And until next we meet, please be safe out there. Bye-bye.
Bye, guys.